this is Matt at LSAT Lab. Today's lesson is about how to master the logic game section. So let's get started with logic games. We want to look at an overview of the section, talk about the process for approaching logic games, look at some of the different game types and question types that you're going to encounter, and discuss what the test writer does in order to increase or decrease the difficulty level of games. That includes both subgroups and non-one-to-one games, and talk about a very powerful technique that will allow you to move faster when you're approaching logic games. It's called framing. So let's get started. On the LSAT, one of the four scored sections will be logic games. And there are 22 to 24 questions in the logic games section. So it makes up 22 to 24% of your total LSAT score. Here's a game. And in this game, we can see that there are a couple different parts. So there's the initial paragraph, which is called the scenario. This is the part of the game that sets up the game type. And then there are the rules that constrict the game, and you have to follow those rules as the game is being played. The process for approaching logic games. First, you need to create a good game board, and the game board is built around the game type. So the game types that we want to be on the lookout for can be divided into three essential families. There's the ordering family, which is 53% of all games. There's the grouping family, which is 35% of all games. And then there's this mixed family, which is 12% of all games. Inside of those families, inside of the world of ordering, there are three game types. There are tree ordering games, standard ordering games, and stacked ordering games. Inside of the world of grouping, there are in-out grouping games, standard grouping games, and stack grouping games. And inside of the world of mixed games, there are hybrids, which are combinations of ordering and grouping. Reassignment games, which are very, very rare. We haven't seen many of these recently, but they can often fit into either a mentality of ordering or grouping, but it's hard to describe them as specifically ordering or grouping. And then mapping games, which again are very rare. We haven't seen one in a very long time, but they generally also can be fit into a category of either ordering or grouping. So inside of the world of ordering games, the first game type to look at is tree ordering games. And tree ordering games are a game where you're trying to take some elements, put them into order, and the rules all coalesce to build a system. In a standard ordering game, you're taking these elements, putting them into order, but you have a lot of different kinds of rules available. And the variability of this game type is much greater than, say, in tree ordering games. Stacked ordering games are games where you're trying to take some elements and put them into order, but there's multiple variable sets to keep track of. And so you're going to need multiple rows in order to track those multiple variable sets. Inside of the world of grouping games, there are in-out grouping games where you're trying to figure out who's in and who's out. And then there are standard grouping games where you have different named teams, and you're taking these players and distributing them onto those different teams. Inside of the world of stacked grouping games, you've got players, you're going to either put them in or out or on different named teams, but you might have a second row in order to track a second variable set along the way. And then there are mixed games, games that combine elements of ordering and grouping. And the most common of that is hybrid games. Hybrid games, you might have some players, you need to figure out who's in and who's out, and then the order of those who are in. Or you might need to take some players and distribute them onto teams and then order them within the teams, or order the teams once you've distributed the players. So there's quite a bit of variability when you're dealing with hybrid games. The second step when you're working on a logic game is to notate the rules. So you want to use some kind of a notational system and notate the rules in a way that makes it so it's easy for you to reference those rules without having to go back and reread the individual sentences and try to reinterpret them each time. After you've notated the rules, then you want to make inferences. You may find that as you work through the rules, you'll be able to determine that some things follow from those rules that you can place into the game board before you begin the questions. And so it's important to pause after you've notated the rules to find those inferences when they're available, and then you approach the questions. Now, there are a variety of different kinds of questions that you'll likely face. So one of the kinds of questions that you'll look at is called a rules question, where they're simply testing your understanding of the rules. You follow the rules, knock out the wrong answer choices, and the answer that remains is the right answer. There's a local question where they give you this new piece of information. It only applies to this particular question, and then you need to use that new information to answer that question. And it doesn't apply when you get to the next question. There are global questions, and these are questions where there's no new piece of information. You just need to use the original set of rules in order to answer the question. There are substitution questions where they say, which one of the following rules would have the same impact on the game as, and then they call out a specific rule. So basically they're asking you to find a different rule within the answer choices that would have the same impact on the game. And these are actually a very challenging game question type. And then there are assignment questions. These questions give you 5 answer choices, and one of them will determine where everybody goes. And then within those question types, there are 3 degrees of certainty that the question could ask for. They might ask you for what must be the case based off of the original set of rules or this new potential piece of information. There are could be true questions, meaning what could be the case based off of that. And then there are cannot be true questions, so what cannot work. And the combination of the different question types with the different degrees of certainty provide for a lot of variability as you're working through the questions. So what makes a difficult game? What makes an easier game? Well, to a certain extent, that depends a little bit on you and what tasks you find simpler and what tasks you find harder. Generally speaking, people find ordering games easier than grouping games. But also, you can see that there's a level of complexity that's at play. So the simpler the organization, let's say you're on a standard ordering game, that's fairly straightforward in terms of its organization, versus a stacked grouping game is a much more complex game board. So the more complex the game board is, the harder it is, as well as the more features that come into play, the harder the game is. So if there's 6 players, you're being asked to put them into order 1 through 6, it's pretty straightforward. But what happens if you have 8 players and you need to fill 6 positions and everybody's got to go somewhere? So some positions are going to have more than one player. So that creates a situation where you have an uneven number of players to positions, and it will increase the difficulty level of the game. So the more features you have, the harder the game is. The more complex the game board is, the harder the game is. So some of the features that you want to be on the lookout for. Games that have subgroups, meaning different kinds of players. 14% of all games have this particular feature, and it's definitely something that will increase the difficulty level. And you can just simply use separated rosters for your elements so that you can remember who's who as you're approaching that game. And then there are non-one-to-one games. So games with an uneven number of players to positions. 23% of all games have this particular feature. And in a situation like this, you're either going to need to double up some of the players on the positions, or some of the positions are going to need to be left blank. But this is another feature that's going to increase the complexity of the game. Framing is one of the most powerful techniques for approaching games. It enables you to move much more quickly as you're solving games. This is a more advanced technique, something that you'll probably want to figure out after you've got the basics down. But essentially what it does is it tells you that there's a couple of limited different ways in which the game can work, and you're trying to figure them out. So Yogi Berra once said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And when it comes to logic games, it's a perfect way of thinking about how to play with logic games, because that is the trick in order to create frames. So when you see that, let's say there's a rule that can only play out in 1 or 2 or 3 different ways within the game board, it's a good idea to take that and try to run with it and create different frames around that particular rule. So for example, if you've got a block where there's H and then a blank and then a blank and then a K, and an order line that only has 5 positions on it, well, there's only 2 places where that block can go. It can go 1 through 4, or it can go 2 through 5. And if you create 2 scenarios or 2 frames around that block, that gives you a starting off place where you can then possibly find further inferences in each one of those frames, and then use those frames in order to answer the questions. Also, when you're working on logic games, remember to preserve your work. This is a final tip, but preserving your work can be very helpful, because a lot of what you're doing is creating hypotheticals and testing cases. And since you create hypotheticals and test cases along the way, you leave a lot of valid work behind that you can then use to answer future questions. So you kind of want to keep your hypotheticals on the page so that you can reference them when you get to another question and potentially save yourself a ton of time. So the process, remember, for approaching logic games is to first create a good game board, then notate the rules, then make any inferences that follow from those rules, and then approach the questions. So the way you master logic games is to understand how the game boards are organized and set up, how to properly notate the rules in a way that's consistent and logical, how to make inferences so that you can find those pieces of information that allow the operation of the game to move more smoothly, and then framing allows you to move more quickly. So that's it for how to master logic games. We've got a ton of lessons on other games. I invite you to check out some of these or visit us at lsatlab.com today.